Exciting for me to be with you. I Last week we tried to show the video and it did not work. The goblins of the internet seem to have had their way. So I rambled on for a few moments with miscellaneous thoughts about Thurman. I appreciated your questions. It helped me get through that time. Ron does know a lot about computers and is adept at technical things. I am none of the above. We're going to try to show the video on my computer. And some of you may ask, well, why keep trying? One of the responses would be because I'm stubborn, and that's just the way I am. But the real reason is that this video is a real treasure. I've seen it probably a dozen times. And every time I see it, I see new things. It's a powerful video done by the same person who did the Dietrich Bonhoeffer video that I've introduced you to. But Dobelmeyer has done some really wonderful videos, and he's a master at this sort of thing. So we're going to try to watch the video. We're going to try to make this work. If we don't, I'll go to plan B. Howard Thurman did love questions. He felt that good questions were perhaps one of the most important things in the spiritual growth. And I ask you to think about a couple of questions as we watch this video or as I talk about experience today. What are the experiences that you see that shaped Howard Thurman's life? What were the experiences and how did they shape his life? And then as you think about that, think about your own life. What experiences have shaped your life that have made a difference in who you are and who you're becoming? And then finally, we might want to take a look at some of the biblical stories and how they have shaped our lives. But I'm going to try to share screen now, and I hope we're going to play the video, but who knows? Who knows?
You're all set for screen share. Don't forget to hit the share, optimize, and share sound on that, John, and then open up the PowerPoint.
Sharing sound, and then I hit share, and then I go down to 3 and slideshow from current slide. All right, we're going to try. It's either going to work or it's not. Y'all let me know if it's not working for you. It'll take a second for it to load if it's going to play. And I'll see you on the other side of it.
I hit your play button.
So why do you do that?
Hit your play button now.
Yeah, there we go.
He was born the grandson of slaves, yet Howard Thurman would become one of the most celebrated religious figures of the 20th century. A spiritual mentor to Martin Luther King Jr.
Whether we want it that way or not, we all tied together.
And a moral anchor for the civil rights movement.
Martin Luther King Jr. would quote Howard Thurman on many, many occasions.
I think Howard Thurman, for many leaders in that movement, King included, played the role of pastor.
In the 1930s, after a historic meeting with Mahatma Gandhi, Thurman becomes one of the early voices for nonviolent resistance, for a people who over centuries experienced unimaginable violence.
He helped to establish the philosophical framework of how to struggle.
He saw himself as a spiritual activist
because he was fundamentally a teacher.
He had this combination of being kind and being strong, and I think that's a very rare combination.
While Sunday morning was often considered the most segregated hour in the week, Thurman helped pioneer a church where people of different races and religions could worship together.
He's suspicious of denomination and dogma and creed. He would never identify himself as a theologian because he thought theologians boxed God.
And he was called a mystic because he believed religious experience was best explored within.
Howard Thurman was actually practicing contemplative spirituality before we actually started calling it contemplative spirituality.
At his heart, he was a nature mystic.
Thurman is talking to trees. Trees.
Yet this mystic was also an outspoken critic of Christianity for its part in the nation's deep racial divides. And he countered with a shocking new work that offered a revolutionary new way of understanding the life of Jesus Christ and how it speaks directly to the oppressed and disinherited.
I carry the book with me, Jesus and the Disinherited, every day.
And he gives an Africanity to the interpretation of Jesus.
He provided a spiritual perspective that was empowering.
There were people encountering Thurman's work and being shaken at their core.
I would have to find out what was the word that the religion of Jesus had to say to the man with his back against the wall.
Major funding for this program was provided by Lilly Endowment.
You will find true success and happiness if you have only one goal. There really is only one, and that is this: to fulfill the highest, most truthful expression of yourself. Theologian Howard Thurman said it best. He said, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive."
The 1960s and the civil rights movement is exploding across America. A century after a civil war was fought to end slavery, deeply rooted segregation and blatant racism are still legal in many parts of the nation. Now they're being met head on.
I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be uneducated, but I am somebody.
Jesse Jackson, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Otis Moss Jr., Vernon Jordan, and other civil rights leaders are convinced the moment for resistance has come. And no matter how they are treated, they are committed to nonviolence.
The spirit in man is not easily vanquished. It is fragile and tough. You may fail again and again, and yet something will not let you give up. Something keeps you from accepting no as a final answer. It is this quality that makes for survival of values when the circumstances of one's life are most against decency, goodness, and right.
They were given the power and the authority to respond to the realities of injustice in ways that could be true to their faith and in ways that did not require them to compromise the integrity of who they were.
Many feel it is Howard Thurman, through his insights and early commitment to nonviolence, who evokes a spirit felt across the entire movement.
Whether we want it that way or not, we are all tied together. Every Negro in America is a little white, and every white man in America is a little Negro. The Negro needs the white man to save him from his fears, and the white man needs the Negro to save him from his guilt. We need each other.
People sometimes seem to think that nonviolence was very endemic to the African American community as a way of life, when in fact it was not. And even Thurman is very clear that nonviolence was a kind of a cultivated experience for most rank and file people, including leadership.
I would agree that Howard Thurman was a saint of the movement.
He gave us the basis for the march, that we know why we march, the principles upon which we march, how we march, and what we do after the march.
He helped to establish the philosophical framework of how to struggle. You cannot let the oppressor break your spirit, then make it break your bones or your arms, but not your spirit. That's the stuff of Howard Thurman.
Dr. King was not completely committed to nonviolence. When I say not committed, he saw it first as a tactic until he was fully converted to it as a lifestyle. And my father helped me with that, to understand that early on, people saw things as a tactic. This is the best way. Dr. King then moves to, this is a lifestyle. And that is a direct connection to Thurman's conversion. And here is a nonviolent revolutionary.
One of the foundational works for the movement is a book by Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited.
I've been told that Dr. King carried Jesus and the Disinherited with him most of the time when he traveled.
It's a book that really describes what it means to be involved in such a struggle as a spiritual matter, as a matter of faith, and not just the effort to change laws for the gaining of civil rights.
He says that the African Americans didn't have any rights, just like Jesus. But they could choose to ground themselves in their own inherent dignity and worth. And if one were to choose this, it would have a lot to do with how they would deal with the question of what do you do when your back is against the wall.
The paradox is that Thurman, who has wide impact on the movement, is not himself first a social reformer. He's much more a spiritual contemplative, what some would even call a mystic.
Howard Thurman is a great example of making the connection between contemplation and social justice.
But the mystic himself is not out on the front lines during many of the marches, and for that, he's often criticized.
He was the teacher, he was the mentor, he was the spiritual sage. He was not the one who was on the front line, but he was the one where people would retreat to be refilled.
They were praying for a great freedom fighter, a liberator. One of them said, you know, we thought we had a Moses, and we ended up with a mystic.
Howard Thurman determined his role as opposed to having people telling him what to do with it. To be independent, to be free, to be available.
For Thurman, one of the great tragedies is that too often on both sides of the racial front lines are Christians. Historically, many churches and denominations suffer deep and painful divisions over issues of race, and Sunday morning is often described as the most segregated hour in America.
It is one of the great spiritual problems of Christianity in America that it has tolerated such injustices between Negroes and whites. It is for this reason that many people all over the world feel that Christianity is weakest when it is brought face to face with the color bar.
The spirituals are a key part of the civil rights movement, and many have their roots in early slave songs. Those songs are now uniting people across generations. Thurman writes one of the first books about the importance of those spirituals for a people who had been reduced to property as slaves.
Something had made it possible for the slave cut off from all of his roots to survive, to hold himself in some vast immunity against the violences of his environment.
I think spirituals are the most powerful music ever created. Spirituals
spirituals were music of resistance in the slave era. There are original spirituals that are sung the way they were sung, but then they retext them, they contextualize them. So you have Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, but then they put in Ain't Gonna Let Sheriff Clark Turn Me Around, Ain't Gonna Let Your Dogs Turn Me Around, Ain't Gonna Let the Hoses Turn Me Around. And it gives them faith and motivation and courage in a situation that facing dogs and hoses, you need the courage if you're going to do it.
Songs like Oh Freedom, Freedom Over Me.
And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave.
Wisdom passed down from the slaves, a sense of creating that inner sanctuary, are all part of Howard Thurman, going back to his earliest days.
So he's basically saying, don't let other people's violence or degrading words or whatever invade your inner sanctuary. That can only happen if you allow that. That's real difficult and psychologically, if in fact you've been hearing this over and over again. But he's saying your strength is this connection to the eternal.
Howard Thurman grows up at the beginning of the 1900s in Daytona Beach, Florida.
It was booming. A railroad had just gone through. The citrus groves were operating, and it became known as a place for oranges. It also became a winter community for wealthy Northerners.
In Daytona, blacks and whites are nearly equal in population. And while Daytona could be more racially tolerant than other parts of the South, there is still legal segregation. And each community knows painfully little about the other.
In my kind of Christianity, the Christian ethic, was binding on me in relation to other Negroes, other black people. But it had no meaning as far as the white world is concerned. There's just nothing. So that they were not a part of my magnetic field of awareness.
You could go to the beach during the day, you could work there, but at night, you needed to get home.
When you're going through a period where you have the Ku Klux Klan identifying itself as a Christian organization, and a period in which people are leaving congregations on a Sunday morning to participate in lynchings, where you have Christian clergy and laity who are either refusing to say something about the kind of discrimination and the kind of violence that is occurring, or are rather tepid in whatever they have to say.
I knew that when my parents took me downtown that I would sit in the back of the bus. I knew that when we got downtown that if I wanted water, it would be colored water, or if I wanted to go to the bathroom, that I would go to the colored bathroom. I understood the rules, but I also had parents who would say as we sat in the back, because you are having to sit here, does not mean that the people sitting up there are better than you.
Thurman's father worked on the railroad. It's a good job, but took him away often. Yet it provides a home and a respectable living for the family. Thurman's father dies when Howard was 7, leaving behind Howard and his 2 sisters.
His mother, being a primary provider for the home, worked doing laundry for persons in the community, white persons in the community.
But it was Thurman's grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, who has the greatest impact on his life. Born in the 1840s, she spent her first 20 years as a slave on a large Florida plantation. She rarely speaks about those early years, but one story stays with Thurman throughout his life.
She said that when she was a young woman on this plantation, once a year, a minister who was a slave on a neighboring plantation was permitted to have a religious service for the slaves. And always, it didn't matter what his subject was, he ended his sermon in the same way. She said he would stand and look at them and he would say, You are not slaves. You are not niggers. You are God's children. So we would all wait for that moment because a faraway look would come in our eyes and just a slight stiffening of a spine. And there was a contagion which came to us as little children that the creator of existence also created me. And therefore, with that sort of backing, I could absorb all the violences of life.
She wanted that to be his primary identity, for him to know that first and foremost, he was a holy child of God, before he learned anything else about himself that people might have said to him as a result of him being a young colored boy in Daytona Beach in the early 1900s.
Thurman describes his childhood as being very lonely. He, I think, always found God in nature. He loved the beach.
I was a very sensitive child who suffered much from the violence of racial conflict. I found that the more I turned to prayer, to what I discovered in later years to be meditation, the more time I spent alone in the woods or on the beach, the freer became my own spirit, and the more realistic became my ambitions to get an education.
In many places, people feel like you experience the presence of God at church. And Howard Thurman did not believe that that was the only place that you could experience God.
Behind their home, a mighty oak tree became the young Thurman's companion.
I discovered that the oak tree and I had a unique relationship. I could sit with my back against its trunk. I could reach down into the quiet places of my spirit, take out my bruises and my joys, and unfold them. I could talk aloud to the oak tree and know that I was understood.
Thurman is talking to trees. Trees.
Florida in the early 1900s provided almost no options for black students after 8th grade. But Thurman is already beginning to excel.
This was part of this early brilliance that one sees, and an incredible work ethic. Brilliance, yes, but a work ethic. So he graduates being the very first African American to complete the 8th grade in Daytona schools. And he goes on to Jacksonville, to the Florida Baptist Academy.
He graduates valedictorian, and as a world war rages in Europe, Thurman writes a personal letter to Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who will later become both president of Howard University and a mentor for Thurman.
There's a piece in this letter that continually inspires me about the life of young people who are committed to service and the importance of mentors who can affirm them. He says, I want to be a minister of the gospel. This is an 18-year-old. I am patriotic. I am willing to fight for democracy, but my friend, Reverend Johnson, my people need me. But he says, please pray for me. Because almost on every hand, I am discouraged in my choice of ministry. Sometimes I think nobody cares.
And he's actually asking Mordecai Wyatt Johnson to become his father.
Johnson encourages Thurman to further his studies, and Thurman heads to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Morehouse was founded after the Civil War to educate freed slaves. One of Thurman's classmates is Martin Luther King Sr.
Howard Thurman said that when he walked into Sale Hall Chapel in 1919 as a freshman, President John Hope went to the lectern, and the first thing he said was, "Young gentlemen." Thurman said the words startled the young men because they were not accustomed, as members of the disinherited community, to being so affirmed, receiving such esteem. And that affirmation, he said, was like pouring iron into their spine.
Thurman was not the most attractive guy in the world. He says this in an unpublished manuscript, so I'm not calling him. I think he's beautiful. But he says his company was not welcomed by the girls, and the guys didn't choose him for the games when they were playing.
At Morehouse, Thurman becomes active in the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, as well as the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he explores ideas of nonviolence.
It was how could he as a black man survive in a world of hatred and oppression. Pacifism was a spiritual resource for him to give him the strength not to hate these people, not to fear these people, but to deal with them as equals.
Before he leaves Morehouse, he reads every book in the library, again becomes valedictorian, and now sets his sights on ministry at Rochester Theological Seminary in upstate New York. He's one of only 2 black students accepted each year.
I believe Rochester is a place where Thurman begins to be aware of how the Christian faith is more than the way in which a particular denomination gives expression, and to have a vision of who are our sisters and brothers beyond even the Christian family.
While studying at Rochester, Thurman receives invitations to speak in white churches, where he's often monitored by the Ku Klux Klan. But he's also doing something more.
He's traveling through Rochester late at night. He is teaching black maids and male servants the very things that he's learning in the seminary, because he has felt indebted that what he is gaining needs to be available to those who do not have the opportunities to be part of this stimulating experience in which he finds himself.
Thurman completes his work at Rochester, but there's one more piece to his education. Thurman stumbles upon a book by a Quaker mystic, Rufus Jones, and not long after, Thurman leaves for Haverford College, outside Philadelphia, to study under Jones.
It would be impossible to discount Rufus Jones' influence on Howard Thurman. I think the Quaker tradition, not only of honoring silence and solitude and interior experience of the divine, but also the recognition of the inner light in everyone, and also the emphasis on social justice, made that a perfect match for Howard Thurman.
In 1926, Howard Thurman marries Katie Kelly.
Just a young woman who is deeply committed to caring for those who are less fortunate.
In October 1927, their daughter Olive is born. But by 1929, tragedy sets in.
Katie contracted tuberculosis from her work as a social worker.
A year later, Katie dies. Thurman is devastated. He returns to Morehouse College to settle in as a single parent and teacher.
All right. Were you able to hear and see that all right? All right, good. Every time I see that, I just have to say, wow. It's an amazing documentary with some pretty challenging images throughout it. A brief comment on the people who participated in it. You might need to know this. Most of them are within an easy drive of us right now. Walter Fluker teaches at Candler now. He was at Boston University running the Howard Thurman Center there and doing the Howard Thurman papers, but he is now at Candler. Julie and I are actually taking a course at Candler School of Theology taught by Dr. Fluker. So we get to visit with him every week, and it's a real treat. But Luther Smith is retired. He was at Candler School of Theology for several decades. He's actually going to be joining us on Wednesday night. I'm teaching a little course down at Peachtree Road Methodist weekly on Howard Thurman and his theology. And Luther has agreed to spend an hour with us this Wednesday. So if you're interested in hearing more from Luther, that session's going to basically consist of asking him questions. Elizabeth and I are going to ask him questions about Howard Thurman. Luther actually knew Howard Thurman, visited with him a number of times in San Francisco and other places, and has been sort of the voice that has kept the legacy of Howard Thurman alive. So we're looking forward to being able to spend an hour with him. If you want to sit in on that, just email me and I'll send you the Zoom link. It's Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. It will later be posted on the Peachtree Road United Methodist Church website, but those postings are usually delayed a week or so. But you just go down the list of the people involved. You have John Lewis, of course, who's now deceased. He was the representative from Atlanta for years in the Congress. You have Greg Ellison, who teaches at Candler. Loretta Coleman Brown taught at Agnes Scott and is still living in Atlanta and does spirituality work in Atlanta. You've just got an amazing lineup of people there. But I would be interested in your reactions to the video. What kind of questions did it pose for you, and what kind of questions do you have about Thurman? As we work through this, I want next week, if this works again, I'm going to show at least the next third of the video and maybe all of it. And during the course of that, I want to talk some about several major parts of Thurman's thinking. Experience is also obviously very important in his theology. He differs from the European theologians in that regard, who started with the revelation of God in Scripture and sort of started with the bigness of God. Howard Thurman starts with experience, and by that he means all experience is a way of encountering God, and so he's very attentive to experience. So I want to talk a little bit more about experience in his theology. Then he also has a vision of unity. He believes that we're all connected, that as human beings, we're all connected. We're connected to God's creation. And he has this beautiful sense of the unity of all being. And I want to lay that out for you if we have time. And then finally, I think one of his major contributions to theology is his understanding of the true self, that self that is beloved by God. And in working through his true self, he realizes that others are also created in the image of God. So the deeper we go into ourselves, the more he feels connected with all other people. So there's some wonderful images there in terms of working with modern day conflict within the church. But let me stop and just let y'all jump in, mute yourself, and ask me any questions, or what are your comments about the video?
John?
Yes.
As influential as he was to King and all the other leaders during the civil rights movement, I thought it was interesting that he really was not so much on the front lines.
Right.
That's what I understood. And was there any resentment that he was not so actively involved, by the leadership?
Not by the leadership. They kind of understood it. There was a lot of resentment by other people that he was not involved. We all have a tendency to want everybody to be in the same box. And Howard Thurman said that you had to be attentive to the grain in your own wood. And he said he was basically a mystic, a person who explored the inner life and then made connections, the inner life, to nonviolence and the social order. So he was very clear who he was, what his gifts were, and he used those gifts in an amazing sort of way. But yeah, there are the real activists within the civil rights movement, the more radical elements, critiqued him for sitting on the sidelines. But he is well known within the Black community. If you are in a interracial group and you mention Howard Thurman's name, usually the Blacks in the group are going to know the name and reverence him. Usually the whites is just a blank look on their face and never heard of it. So, and I have a passion for changing that, because I think he speaks to the white community in some pretty powerful ways, in some ways that we desperately need to hear. One of the questions I got from my Wednesday night session was, why can't the Blacks forgive us for what we did? And that just gets me set off because I don't think we reach a place of harmony racially until we can get them to grips with some of the images in that video and realize that that's our history. White supremacy is our history. And you think, well, that's over now. No, it's not. This election, there were 200 voting rights bills designed for one thing. None of that had anything to do with voting irregularities. It all had to do with suppressing minority vote. And until we're able to recognize that, claim it as our problem, no, people are not going to get over it. We got to deal with that. And I think there's a lot of inner work that needs to be done. And I think Thurman's major contribution is that he believes you got to do inner work in order to do outer work. And I think he has a lot to say to us. But thank you for that question. Other comments or questions or swearing at me or whatever you want to do.
John.
Yes.
You think within the kind of mainstream Christian church, mystic sort of has a bad connotation?
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in a sense, I think if you're a Methodist, you got to be a little bit mystical, because John Wesley's experience at Aldersgate was a mystical experience of the power of God, of the presence of God. And Charles Wesley was much more of a mystic than he was. Charles Wesley, in his music, reflects an appreciation of the firsthand experience of God. The only thing that a mystic is someone who believes that you do not need the trappings of church, the trappings of authority to encounter God, but you can encounter God just through your experience, firsthand. You need no intermediaries to lead us to God. And that's to demystify the word mystic, I think is one of the things we need to do. There are far out mystics, but I suspect most of us, when we think about it and reflect on our lives, have some mystical streak in us. How many of us can remember times in our lives when we were touched by the presence of God? And we can still talk about those experiences. So in a sense, I think we're all mystics. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, because there's, the writings of the mystics and all of that, and that gets into a lot of detail. But he would say, be attentive to your experience. Pay attention. You'll find God trying to speak to you in all sorts of ways. Go out and look at the Japanese magnolias. Listen for God's voice in that. Look at the jonquils, the spring. He would say, open your eyes, open your ears, because God's speaking to you there. And that's the stuff of mysticism. And if you look at mystical writers, they were not people who were disconnected from life. St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Thomas Merton, all of them were very activist in terms of the social issues of the day. But yes, he was a mystic.
John,
Yes.
I wish Frank were here because he would certainly identify with Howard Thurman finding God in nature.
Yes, he would.
And he found it so frustrating that he couldn't get the church to realize that was part of our religion.
Right.
But he would have certainly been a disciple of Howard Thurman.
Well, I know he was because Frank and I had some long conversations about Howard Thurman. We had some wonderful conversations. So he was well aware of Howard Thurman and his love of nature, his nature mysticism. So Frank was ahead of his time. And we're still trying to catch up to what he saw and understood. If we still have a planet in 10 years, if we don't get busy, we're not going to have a planet. And Thurman, by the way, his theology speaks to the issues that Frank was so passionate about, of God's creation and our responsibility to it. Other comments?
I love the influence of his grandmother.
Yes.
And I think that and his mother, I'm sure, was spending all of her time and energy working. But to have that grandmother in his life made a huge difference, it would seem.
Yeah, his father dying when he was only 7. Did we talk about that story last week?
Yes.
What happened at the funeral? Okay.
Yeah.
He that sort of set him on a path of going deeper into religion, but it also removed his mother Alice from the family because she worked as a domestic and worked kind of around the clock. They had a good living with Saul working with the railroad, but when he died, they were left with her having to earn enough money to keep the house, to keep the family going. And so she became less of an influence in Thurman's life because she worked around the clock. And his grandmother became the major shaping influence. And of course, she was from South Carolina, was moved to a plantation in northern South Georgia, northern Florida, and spent 20 years of her life as a slave. And she had a deep and profound influence on him. Other questions?
I guess I was just struck by how such a small thing as the president of Morehouse calling them young gentlemen made.
Yeah.
And how serendipitous to run across the book by the Quaker.
Right.
That came to mean a lot to him. So just seeing all these small things working together, influencing his life and his theology.
Yeah, and he reflected on that and realized, it's a part of his experiential theology, which again, I think matches up well with Methodists. He had some amazing experiences throughout his life.
What happened to his sibling?
Linda, you asked the question last week about what do we do in our day and time with all of the mean-spiritedness, the division, that sort of thing. you know, you look at Thurman, and of course, he went to Morehouse, and he was there in 1919. And in 1919 and 1920, it was called the Red Summer. There were lynchings all over the country. There were lynchings in Georgia. It was a mean and maddening time. And he was able to love other people even in the midst of that horror. And he did it through the inner work. And I think he would say, as we become activists in our day and time, be mindful of the inner sanctuary. You remember Loretta Coleman Brown talked about the importance of that inner work, that inner sanctuary, not letting anything destroy that image of God within us through our own anger and our resentment and our work. And so I think Thurman would call us to do some really tough inner work right now. And as a church, I think we have to do that. I know I've fallen into periods of resentment about people that are talking about taking our beloved Methodist Church and running away with it and creating a new denomination that looks more conservative than the old Southern Baptist Church. And that creates some hackles for me. And I realize when I get feeling real angry about that, I need to do some inner work myself to come to grips with that and not let me become a mean and resentful person. And Howard Thurman is just a great example of how that can be done. I think he teaches us a great deal about that. Other questions?
John, you have spoken to this, but if Howard Thurman were with us today, what would he be saying to us?
Well, I think he would say, first, do the inner work. Make sure that you are taking care of your own soul. And he would say, don't get caught up in the doctrines and the fights in the church about who's the biggest believer and who's not. He's not a doctrinal person. He would say, the answer's not there. The answer is deep within your own soul. Do that work. It will connect you with other people. And he would say, be active, but don't neglect your own soul. That person you disagree with is also a beloved child of God. Get that straight before you enter into disagreements with them. And of course, John, in your work as a judge, you saw the best in people, but occasionally you saw the worst in people. Well, more than occasionally. I think he would say we need to keep doing that inner work. But the amazing thing about his vision is that he sees a unity in all things. He sees a unity with nature. He sees a unity with creation. And he would say, let's be about building bridges with other faith traditions. He would even want to sit down and talk with the white supremacists and say, let's sit down and have a heart-to-heart here, soul talk. And he wouldn't talk politics with them. He would talk soul with them. And I think we need to do more of that in our day and time because we've gotten so divided that we don't talk anymore. And he would say, no, that's important. We do need to talk. We do need to sit and think together. And he'd also say a lot of times we need to stop talking and just be quiet. And I love that too. Be quiet and get in touch with that inner authority. So he would have a lot to say to us, though, John, I think. Other questions or comments?
John, I've often thought about what would it have been like during the civil rights days if we'd had Facebook and the internet.
Wow. It has, I think the Me Too movement and the Floyd movement, that whole thing has been spread through through Facebook, through media. I think it would have moved things faster. I do think that if you listen to Dr. King's essential message, you realize what a great impact Howard Thurman had on him. That idea we are all connected. We're all God's children. King got that directly out of Howard Thurman. And Jesse Jackson's speeches that you are somebody. He got that directly out of Howard Thurman. I would think that I hope that over the next decade that we will use media, social media, to spread the message of nonviolence, the message of that we're all God's children. And I think there are real possibilities of that. For instance, that class I'm teaching down at Peachtree Road, it's a class of about 50 people that have been meeting for the last 10 years. But right now it's about 120 people from around the country. I've got people in Boston and people in Washington. And that's an example of how a class that used to be 30, 40 people each week is now over 100 people. And I think social media is able to do that. I just wish we would focus more on positive things like this and less on the negative. We seem to be more about opinions than we do about working on our own souls.
Yeah, that was what I was kind of getting at. I was thinking, it would have certainly made it easy to organize marches and all this and that if the internet had been around. But you look at all the negative impact of it and people making snide comments that they wouldn't make to your face. And I don't know, like I said, social media definitely needs to change in that regard, but
Well, and I'm very encouraged by Thurman. I think he is a voice that is just beginning to be needed in our world. He spoke to the civil rights movement, but we've got a much more difficult humanity problem. We're building walls left and right. And he would begin to say, and this may get back to John Gerald's book too, he would say, let's tear down some of those walls. Let's start thinking about our common humanity, our common trait as the beloved children of God, and let's tear down some of those walls. And so that's the flip side of that we could be passing along that message as well. Other questions or comments? I want to, while we are sharing screen, I want to go back to that. If I can get back to it, I want to go back and share screen and show you. Let's see, share. I want to go back and show you this chart. Are y'all seeing that yet? I got to do slideshow from beginning. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it?
Yeah.
I don't want
to. You're starting the video again.
I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Okay. Let's go back. All right. Are you seeing this on the screen? There we go.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that? Okay. This is a paper written by David Steindl-Rast on the mystical core of religion. Can you see that well enough? Let me explain it. Look to the left side. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Where it says founders.
That's the sign of something.
That's the place where experience comes in, which is in the mystical view of things, the heart of religion. The experience of God, the experience of other people, the experience of the holy. And so faith really begins with some kind of experience. And what experience does then, what the mind does then, it begins to see the truth in that. It begins to look for goodness in that and look for the beauty in that. That's not my phone. And then the mind, see that next little concave thing there, the mind then begins to refract what it has learned and experienced. The intellect interprets the experience and begins to make doctrine or creeds out of it. The will begins to look at the experience and begins to make commitments and to commit commitments to other people, and that creates ethics. Then the emotions, the wonder, the awesomeness, the beauty begins to celebrate the experience, and that creates rituals. And there we're creating religion, doctrine and ethics and ritual. Over time, though, all of those things become more and more fixed. We have, for doctrine, we become dogmatic. If you don't believe this way, then you're not a believer. Ethics, we get very legalistic. If you don't behave this way, then you can't belong to our religious club. And then, of course, ritual, as beautiful as it can be, the beauty of worship, the goodness of worship, can become ritualistic and become cold if it's not revived from time to time. And so in David Steindl-Rast view, when that happens, the mind has to be purified and goes back to experience again, and starts the process again. But let me show you what Thurman does, if I can. Yeah, there we go. Now, this is my chart here. Thurman, go over to the left of the chart. He experiences God, he experiences self, he experiences nature, he experiences the ordinary things of life, the extraordinary moments of life, and he uses the spiritual disciplines to help guide him through that. And that creates what he views as truth, goodness, and beauty. Thurman, though, gets to this point of doctrine and ethics and ritual and turns back around and says, no, we got to go back and get more experience. He does not believe that we can continue to experience God or others in doctrine or ethical systems that are too fixed or ritual. So he returns us back to experience. He says we got to go back and get more experience. So in Thurman's view, doctrine becomes very dangerous, and he wants us to return to experience. Whereas in doctrine, a lot of our debate within the Methodist Church right now is how doctrinaire we're going to become, whether we're going to force everyone to follow the same doctrinal understandings. Who's in and who's out will be determined by doctrine. In Thurman's view, we're all in. We're all beloved children of God, and we all experience God, and that's where we need to place our focus. I wanted you to see that, and if you have questions, we can talk about them. What I want to do is close with a meditation by Howard Thurman. These are his words, not mine, that I want you to ponder. And then we'll close for today. And then next week, I want to go back and watch the next section of the video and talk a little bit more about experience and the unity of life and the true self. But just hear these words of Howard Thurman, where he talks about the importance of experience, the personal presence that is before us all. And we'll use this as our closing meditation. Hear these words from Howard Thurman. The only strength for me is to be found in the sense of personal presence everywhere. It scarcely matters whether it is called human or divine, a presence which only makes itself felt at first in this or that particular form and picture. Into this presence we come, not by leaving behind what are usually called earthly things, or by loving them less, but by living more intensely, more intentionally into them, and loving more what is really lovable in them. For it is literally true that this world is everything to us if we only choose to make it so. If only we live in the present, because indeed this present moment is eternal. In a very real sense, we're earthbound creatures caught always in the rigid context by which our experiences are defined. The particular fact or experience which we're facing at the moment, or the memory of other particular facts or experiences from other moments, these are openings. These are doors through which we enter into wider meanings, into wider contexts. Listen to that again. He's talking about every experience we have. These are openings. These are doors through which we enter into wider meanings, wider contexts. When our little world of particular experiences seems illumined by much more than itself, and we seem to be caught up in something bigger than our own little lives, we give such moments special names. They are watershed moments. We mark those times in special ways, with special symbols, with special rituals. If it is the love of a man and a woman, it's the ring, the ceremonial, or the deep stillness of intimate disclosure. If it's the peak of joy, the emptying of the soul in suffering, or the fragmented activities of this daily round, there's a sense of an altar, the searching phrase from the holy book, or the gathered tear and the quickening pulse. At such times, and in myriads of others perhaps, we know that we live our way deeply in the present, only to discover that we are invaded by the eternal. He ends with this prayer: sensitize our spirits, our Father, that we may tread reverently in the common way, mindful that the glory of the eternal is our companion. May we not shrink from the present intensity of our experiences, lest we turn away from the redeeming power of thy perfect love. Amen. That's our time, and we shall see you next week, same time, same station. And Ron, we'll see if we can make it work again next week, okay?